We negate contention 1 is diversion. Mabonda explains in 2019 that the BRI has significantly invested in improving infrastructure in Africa. For example, in Kenya, where China has invested $14 billion to build a railway. The initiative gives developing countries an opportunity to have space in the global economy, create jobs, and guarantee prosperity. Unfortunately, China won't be able to fund a new Silk Road to Europe and maintain the investment currently being funneled into Africa at the same time. Bakalanau of NBC News contextualizes in 2017 that to create a Eurasian Belt and Road, a $1.4 trillion network of modern trading routes would be built. It envisions new roads, high-speed rail, power plants, pipelines, ports, airports, and telecommunications links. And because China won't have enough funds left, the most vulnerable will be left behind. If you affirm, China will prioritize European projects for 2 reasons. First is because of EU's geopolitical advantage. Wang of the Global Research Center writes in 2019 that China wants to ideally push the U.S. out of its Asian region, or at the very least to reduce its influence, to achieve regional hegemony that makes all actors ultimately dependent. China is acting globally to displace the U.S. wherever it can, including in major parts of Europe through the BRI. Second is investor confidence. Lawrence of Bloomberg finds that risks remain in investing in Africa. Multinationals have avoided doing business there because of the potential for corruption. The absence of transparency and accountability in dealing with public officials has led to a lack of confidence in the country's private sectors. This environment has posed risk to companies that lack proper internal controls and anti-corruption programs. He furthers that Africa has had the highest level of corruption in the world for the past 10 years. Additionally, the Q Vice President of the African Development Bank explains that foreign investors working in Africa encounter daunting economic, political, and social risks that reduce their ability to make investment decisions. Investors value balanced, consistent, and predictable regulation in any given country. The impact is poverty, as Satana of the International Journal of Applied Econometrics finds that households living in rural communes with roads have a 67% higher probability of escaping poverty than those without them. That's critical, as the World Bank finds that 413 million people in Africa currently live in extreme poverty. Further, Yellen of the University of California implicates that the poor experience a more than 2-fold higher risk of mortality. Contention 2 is a shift in alliances. The EU joining the BRI creates U.S.-China tensions. Zhu finds in 2019 that China's ambitious BRI spans much of the world. The U.S. sees it as a direct challenge to its global supremacy, especially in its traditional spheres of influence. The world is entering an era of great uncertainty as U.S.-China competition intensifies. This is because the U.S. feels threatened by China's expansion into Europe. Italy proves, Deutsche Welle contextualizes in 2019, that the U.S. had stern words for Italy following the announcement of them joining the BRI. Trump's special assistant claimed that Italy endorsing the BRI lends legitimacy to China's predatory approach to investment and will bring no benefit to the Italian people. This has brought about a power struggle, as Schuman continues in 2019, that in its attempts to contain China, the U.S. is discovering to its dismay that its allies aren't always on board. The warrant stems from U.S. paranoia of Chinese expansion, as Horowitz 19 continues. China has made incursions that have caused deep anxiety in Washington, who has warned that 5G networks could be used by Beijing to spy on communications. The impact of a deterioration in relations concerns the weakening of NATO. Sani finds in 2018 the BRI, while currently an ambitious economic project, could develop into a long-term alliance. With European NATO member states enthusiastically participating in the BRI, unity between NATO member states could weaken, as the BRI could provoke a conflict of interest between economic commitments and military commitments of member states. As NATO gets weaker, China and Russia grow more aggressive, as Rose finds in 2018. Russia and China's improving military capabilities, coupled with their aggressive actions in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and the East China Sea, have created serious concerns. And that means Europe militarizes by itself. Rose continues that numerous leaders in Europe have spoken of the need for European nations to take their fate into their own hands when it comes to security. Danucci implicates in 2018 that European citizens will always pay with consequent cuts to social spending, and the Borgen Project quantifies in 2018 that 1 in 4 Europeans experiences poverty. Income poverty alone affects 17.3% of Europeans, and an additional 118 million people of the EU population were at risk of poverty. And Treasy in 2018 concludes that economic security programs are effective against poverty. Thus, we negate.
We affirm in our sole contention is ensuring development abroad. In the status quo, China is being forced to take a step back from the Belt and Road Initiative. Pei 19 of the Asian Review explains that the Chinese economy is unstable and on the decline. Capital flight of trillions of dollars and overproduction have caused the CCP to cut back on risky and exorbitant projects on the Belt and Road, with potential to force an abandonment from the project altogether. Moreover, Schrader 18 of Jamestown explains that domestic discontent caused by slowing economic conditions have already forced China to scale back investment, finding that commercial banks have completely ceased financing and state banks have cut funding by 89%. An opportunity for a European-led and Belt and Road Initiative has arisen. In fact, Dasgupta 19 of VOA News finds that Xi himself is willing to cede control over the initiative to gain participation from wealthy countries like Germany and France. This is evident in Xi's current actions, as Jung Ho, 19, at the South China Morning Post explains that Xi has stopped pledging new funding to the initiative, instead focusing on strategy of co-development. Affirming thus signals a shift to a new Belt and Road led by democratic and transparent nations. Zhou, 17, of SIPRI finds that within the initiative, the EU will be able to adopt a leadership position and shape the Belt and Road for the better. Baresh, 18, of the Project 2049 Institute finds that this EU-led reform is sure to resolve common controversial aspects of the BRI, specifically those that harm the nations within the initiative. The success of an EU-led BRI is ensured by the Chinese government itself. Pang, 19, of the Council on Foreign Affairs finds that the Chinese government needs effective trade and growth from the Belt and Road to restructure its economy and transform it from the middle income trap by creating and exporting largely high-value goods. Thus, affirming and saving the Belt and Road Initiative through EU financing will improve economic conditions in 3 ways. The first is trade agreements. Cole, 19, of the University of Groningen writes that Belt and Road Initiative will reduce trade costs by creating free trade agreements that lower tariffs and remove other trade impediments with nations included in the program. Pelkman, 16, of the Center of European Policy Studies writes that with free trade agreements, trade will double and GDP in China and Europe will increase up to 1.87% and 0.76% higher respectively. Second is transport infrastructure. Amagini of the University of Piemonte explains that transport costs between China and Europe are 20% higher than average, but the Belt and Road Initiative has the ability to be a game changer for transport costs and increase trade volume by building advanced transport infrastructure. Indeed, Cole, 19, of the Oxford finds that poor infrastructure accounts for 60% of trade costs for countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. The World Bank explains that because of faster exchanges, trade for countries in the Belt and Road Initiative will increase 9.7% and worldwide trade will increase 6.2%. Ultimately, the World Bank furthers that global income will rise by 2.9%. The third is power grids. Cornell, 19, of the Atlantic Council explains that China has begun to undertake projects creating power grids in developing nations to create demand for Chinese green energy. These power grids allow for these nations to reorient their economies towards advanced manufacturing. Science Daily 19 for these solar grids are only able to be undertaken by the BRI, which creates a framework for exporting clean energy to underdeveloped nations, giving them the ability to decouple economic growth and increase carbon emissions. Cornell, 19, of the Atlantic Council continues that the BRI power grid investments will create 200 million jobs by 2050. The impacts of these BRI grids are already manifesting, as U18 of China Daily finds that just in Brazil, the Belt and Road Initiative has pulled 22 million people out of energy poverty. Bailey, 16, of The Reason explains that raising countries out of energy poverty allows countries to advance their economies with manufacturing. Moreover, Bailey continues that raising economies out of poverty allows them to be more resilient to climate change as industries are less climate dependent. Overall, Malazweska, 19, of the World Bank finds that the Belt and Road Initiative will lift 34 million people out of moderate poverty and 8.6 out of extreme poverty. Thus, we affirm.
Okay, good for cross.
Mm-hmm.
Can I take the first question?
Yep.
All right, so let's just start at the top of your first contention, where you talk about how there's like abandonment of the BRI and that the bank's financing has gone down. When is this evidence from that says like the bank financing is completely shut off?
The Schrader evidence?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay, we'll call for it after cross. But like, when would you say the bright line is when the BRI completely collapses?
I don't know. We say it's stagnating right now.
Okay,
But
how
they
long has
probably
it been
aren't-
stagnating for? Is this like a recent development, or has it just been going on for years?
No, it says it's because of China's economic slowdown.
Okay, got it. You can have a
Okay.
question.
Cool. So you say that the U.S. doesn't want to work with 5G networks, and that's why NATO collapsed. So when Italy signed on with the BRI, did they allow China to build 5G networks?
I'm sure you can tell me, but
They
like,
did not.
It's about U.S. perception. It's not about like you probably gonna read some non-EU.
Wait, if the U.S. perceives that 5G networks aren't being built,
it's literally just paranoia. It's not what it has nothing to do with whether or not they do it. It's just that the U.S. is worried that they're going to. Like,
wait, but if they keep in the MOUs, hey, you can't build 5G networks, then the U.S. won't be paranoid, right?
well, if that's just Italy. Do they build them in other countries, or is Italy a special case?
Well, Italy's the one that signed on to the BRI. They're the EU.
Well, there's like
country
17 more EU countries that have signed on to the BRI. So unless you can prove like all of them just like shut out 5G.
I don't know about the
I
other
still
ones, but
think
do you?
perception is like enough to trigger the impact.
Okay.
Or it's just part of the link. But can I have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so you talk about how EU reform is sure to solve conflicts, but like, what is the warrant as to why?
So right now, China doesn't have any funding, and then when the EU starts funding it, they have control over the initiative,
control.
so they will implement EU standards.
Okay, they're going to implement EU standards. Like China's just going to adopt EU policy.
Well, no, it's that it's a European-led.
Oh, so it's just like China's done with the BRI after that.
Well, no, it's like when the EU finances projects, they gain some sort of control over these projects, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some sort of control. But, yeah. Okay. You can have a question.
Yeah. So you talk about how militarization will cause like austerity cuts, right? Hasn't the EU been in austerity since the 2008 recession?
Okay, yeah, I mean, sure, but it's really only like certain countries that have been hit so hard by the recession, like Italy and Greece. But like, there's still
Wait, all of the EU is in austerity.
Okay, like how? What exactly do you mean?
So like, the EU Parliament right now, there's a law that you can't have spending above like 3% of your GDP or something like that because they're still in austerity from the 2008 recession.
Okay, well, I feel like if they're going to spend more on their military, it's just going to get even worse. But can I take a question?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's go to where. Let's go to where you talk about how the BRI like changes. Like, what kind of transport infrastructure is going to be built?
Like ports, roads, railways.
Okay, so it's like both overland and like ocean.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to clarify.
So you say that China and Russian aggression is going to make the EU militarize. But if China starts...
When NATO gets weaker, that's when like China and Russia militarize.
Okay, but if China starts trading with the EU, won't the EU feel safe because now they have a security guarantee from China?
No, not militarizes against the EU. That's
not what I said.
Yeah. No. Like China gets aggressive not against the EU, just aggressive in general because they're enabled by the EU. Sorry, that's time.
Time begins now. So starting off with the overview. Right now in the status quo, the EU has its own infrastructure program and it's a much better alternative. Cameron in 2018 finds that the new connectivity strategy will offer a different approach to that taken by Beijing. The EU emphasis is on sustainability, proposing that investment should respect labor rights, not create dependencies, and guarantee a level playing field for businesses. EU ambassadors in China also released a report critical of the BRI for being the opposite economically, environmentally, socially, and financially unsustainable. And the US actually supports this. The Daily Times in 2018 says that Washington has long used the EU to further its interests, meaning that the US will not regard the strategy as supplementing its interests, will regard it as supplementing its interests. Therefore, they need to prove the fact that like the BR is like inherently better than the current connectivity strategy, and why the EU would prefer the BRI over this. Then onto the this side. But then this opposes the BRI. Like, since the US opposes like joining the EU joining the BRI, it would hurt relations. The Roar in 2019 tells you that in joining the Belt and Road Initiative, Italy's government is breaking links with the most powerful countries of the West and defying the Trump administration, who has been outspoken in its criticisms of Chinese overseas infrastructure project. That damages multilateral cooperation, which is critical, as the White House continues in 2014 that the US and the EU have joined forces as partners to address key foreign policy and security issues. Savechis contextualizes in 2010 that issues like terrorism, the nuclearization of North Korea, Iran, the growing power of China, the promotion of peace in the Middle East, poverty and climate change, and other emergent problems require further cooperation. A vibrant transatlantic partnership remains a real possibility, but only if both sides make the necessary political commitment. Therefore, in their role, they need to prove as to why this loss of connection/relations with the EU, between the EU and the US, outweighs those created between the EU and China. Then onto their case. So then they reach you the fact that the economy is declining, it's going to collapse, or basically that it's suffering a lot. But they provide you absolutely no plan as to why, when this is going to happen. And I would contend that in the status quo, since this is happening for a while, they need to prove their world is unique in the sense that it's going to collapse. And then they tell you this whole warranting behind their case is that the Xi Jinping will cede control to the EU. However, this provides no actual warranty, because why hasn't China implemented these policies in the first place? Obviously they've been in investment for a long time, and there wasn't any reason as to why China isn't doing this in the status quo. Therefore, why would Xi Jinping just completely give control of the Belt and Road Initiative to the EU, or use its policies, when in reality that the whole purpose of the BRI is for geopolitical hegemony. So as a result, they need to provide some sort of warranty saying as to why China hasn't done this right now, and why they will listen to the EU. So then onto their warranting that says that it's going to reduce trade costs. They first need to tell you as to why these 2% increase of wage and poverty, impacts poverty the most. I think that could be second one, I'm not sure. But what this basically says is that sure, maybe some people will increase in wage, but they don't tell you sure, what if someone makes $2? If their wage increased by 2%, they need to say how this 2% impacts the whole poverty as a whole, and as a result they don't have any warranty linking into their impacts. So then onto their third warrant, you can delink this because these grids aren't going to be going to these places that require them the most, these countries that are dependent on fossil fuels as well as CO2 based energy, because we tell you in our internal our warranting that when the EU is going to join, China is going to primarily invest in the EU and divert funding from Africa to the EU. So none of these power grids are actually going to go to these countries, and they need to prove as to why the EU will fund investment into these third world countries, and as a result they don't get access to any of their impacts, and as a result vote on.
start at the top of our case on their overview. The first thing they tell you is the EU has its own plan, and we need to prove why the BRI is better. Two issues here. First, we tell you they're going to combine the Juncker plan, which is the connectivity plan from EU. They talk about with the BRI. This allows them to both synergize and then gives China the funding they need to not only connect the EU and China, but also to connect to Africa, which solves for their entire case. But secondarily, we tell you uniquely the BRI is better because not only does it connect Europe to itself, it also connects Europe to China to like Africa, and connects the entire nation or connects the entire world together. That's better than just connecting one continent. But then their next thing is they say it hurts U.S. relations with Europe. One, there's literally no impact to this. They don't read a single impact. Don't let them read it later. Second, Trump is super isolationist right now, so I would pretend this is already happening. The U.S. relation with the EU is already completely toast. We're already stepping out of it, and Trump says he hates the EU all the time. Their next response is that there's no bright line as to when the BRI collapses. We tell you the progress is stopped right now, and projects are halted right now due to funding issues. Their next response is that Xi won't concede reform. That doesn't make any sense. Xi has two options: either A, he concedes minor reforms and his foreign policy for everything he wants to do outside of China survives, or B, he concedes no reform, the BRI fails, and he's a complete policy failure for all of his foreign policy objectives. The choice is pretty clear for Xi. Then their next response is that wage increases aren't linked to poverty. This doesn't make any sense. For people who are living off of cents a day, it's always better to have a wage increase, which is why specifically we tell you in our impact we pulled 34 million people out of poverty. That's a pretty clear impact. But then they read the thing about fossil fuels and how they're going to increase fossil fuels in their world. We tell you right now that the paying evidence specifically tells you they're shifting to green tech. But now let's go to their case. Yeah, first at the top, they say that you can't fund both the EU project and Asia. The issue is the EU provides $123 billion in funding via its external action budget, but secondarily they also have the Juncker plan, which has $560 billion. At this point, that's clearly enough money to do both plans, which means their entire first contingent is solved for. But even if you don't buy that, let's go into the warrants. First on geopolitics. China wants to secure the Indian Ocean because they want to secure an alternate trade route other than the South China Sea, which is why they're always going for the Indian Ocean and not just connecting to the EU, because they want to establish other trade routes. So in the case of the South China Sea trade gets disrupted by a war or something, they have other options. But then, second, the way China spreads their geopolitical hegemony is with building military bases. They can't do this in the EU because all the EU countries aren't going to let them build military bases, and they already have ports there. They need to go into the developing world where there aren't ports. They're establishing fresh ports and make political bases to spread their influence. But then, lastly, China wants to also spread authoritarianism, and it's a model of government. It came to this in the EU because the EU already has governments established. They want to go into areas that don't have governments established, build countries up from the bottom up, and they become reliant on China for economically and politically, which is why they go into the developing world. The incentive structure is pretty clear. But then on investor confidence, first, investors always wanted to diversify their portfolios. They want to have a multitude of investments, so that way, if one failure, if the EU has a recession in the EU, they still have their investments in Africa to make the money. But then, second, they say that corruption is the issue. The issue is EU reform solves because when the EU makes the BRI better, the corruption issues and transparency then increases when investors are no longer as scared. The EU, their case is the only world where investors are sketched out in Africa. But then, we tell you, investors also uniquely want to invest in the developing world because there's the most room for growth and profits. Because where there's no industrialization, there's a complete future to build entire nations, which means you have a huge return on investment as compared to marginal economic increases that they can get out of the EU. Now let's go to contention 2. First, at the top of their case, they say that the U.S. sees this as a challenge to their hegemony. This doesn't make any sense. Instead, the U.S. sees it as a challenge to their hegemony, so the United States is going to leave NATO. That doesn't make any sense. The United States gains a ton of geopolitical clout via NATO. They're not going to leave the one organization that connects them to the rest of the world, makes them a global superpower. Our warrant makes more sense than theirs because when the United States wants to increase its influence, it's not going to leave the one way it gets influence. But then secondarily, their only link is 5G at the point where the nations that have joined the BRI in the EU aren't getting 5G, like Italy isn't getting 5G, their link never triggers. But then, moreover, they say that the US had a super strong response to Italy joining the BRI. The response that they talk about where they say that the US literally condemned them was just a tweet. That, it's not like that's the strong condemnation they talk about. But then on the impact, first, the EU already has austerity. Germany is already in a recession, and the EU has austerity policies across the board. In the Constitution right now, they can't spend more than 3% in debt, which is why they're already in austerity. This is not unique. But then secondarily, we can't pull out NATO for two reasons. Maryland of ABC News explains that Trump can't unilaterally pull US out of NATO, but secondarily, it would also ruin him politically, which means he won't do it now because he wants to get re-elected in 2020. But then, lastly, on the idea of the impact, Russia's already super aggressive. This is not unique. They give you a bunch of things Russia did. NATO literally did nothing. This proves NATO is not a solvency mechanism for Russian aggression or aggression in the world at large.
So why hasn't Xi Jinping tried to do any investment policy reforms in the status quo?
Because the EU hasn't joined yet.
But why can't they just do that now?
Because why would he reform something when the EU isn't going to join?
Why hasn't he done this in the past?
Because the EU hasn't joined in the past.
But if the BRI is China's baby, why would they just let it die? Why wouldn't they try to reform their own?
We tell you right now, that's why they're saying join us and we'll reform. That's
but the question is why specifically do they want these policies or frameworks or whatever y'all talk about? But why haven't they done this now? They're so they've done investment in the past, right? So
well, we tell you, realistically, in the debate round, the EU probably isn't going to join the BRI. What we tell you is if they do join, then Xi would be here's reforms. If you join, I'm willing to trade these reforms. That's the evidence we read you. That's why it hasn't happened in the past.
Did Xi Jinping say, I'm going to take your reforms?
Yeah, the South China Morning Post evidence says, Xi said, we will concede reforms if the EU joins the BRI.
Like, okay, we'll ask for that evidence.
Okay.
You have a question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm an investor, do I want to invest where there's little room for growth or a lot of room for growth?
I would say in a place that has like good credit scores, like things that will give you like a good return on their investment.
Wait.
Since not
So
Africa.
would you rather get on like on the ground floor of like a country that has like room for like thousands upon thousands of % of increased growth over the next century, or like
But also
Germany,
no
which is
chance
going
of
to have to be more
return a low
growth.
credit score.
Right, but like at some point these nations are probably going to industrialize, right? They're not just going to stay unindustrialized
Yes, but like
forever.
you don't give me any warranting as to why the EU will like specifically go into the countries like go to Africa.
Okay, so if these countries have to develop at some point, that just means it's a matter of time until they see that like 10,000%
So like
return on investment.
you haven't
right?
told me as to why when the EU joins the BRI they're going to invest in Africa
Wait, I mean, we responded to the war and some stuff. Like,
by saying.
I don't know. I read like 6 responses. I'm hoping you float them. You want a question?
Yeah, sure. So, if like right now, like, or sorry, actually, no, you can have a question. I have a question about it.
Okay. So, if Europe isn't getting the 5G you talk about in case, why is the United States scared?
So, like, we're not telling you specifically that it's not just this 5G, but like just the idea of like things such as 5G is what links into like American paranoia of like Chinese dealings
What is
with
the
the EU.
idea of something like
So,
5G that's not 5G?
For instance, like the whole 5G fiasco that happened is just an example of how American paranoia has been like shown to increase tensions.
Okay. So we're scared. We're like, oh no, China's expanding their influence. Let's leave the one organization.
We never
gives
said
us a
that.
ton of
We never
influence.
said that the U.S. is going to leave NATO.
Then why does NATO collapse?
We see NATO collapse because it weakens because of a conflict of interest between EU countries and China.
So NATO's just gonna get weak.
NATO's going to get
Doesn't
weaker.
the United States always have a vested incentive to keep NATO not weak because that gives them geopolitical?
Yes, but like the problem is that it deteriorates because there's a conflict of interest between EU countries that are in the BRI versus
NATO's
America.
purpose is to make sure Russia doesn't start a war. That's like still the purpose at the end of the day, right?
I mean, I guess, but also as well as China as well. But
Okay.
it's found on the principles of Russia, but also China as well.
Start on the overview. We tell you that their case is totally non-unique because the EU has its own infrastructure program and it's a better alternative. They say that they're going to like synergize these programs and the BRI is better because of scope, but we would contend that that's not true. They're totally muddling our case here. The connectivity strategy also extends to the whole world. It's like pretty much the same thing as the BRI, and with all this bad stuff happening, we would contend that the connectivity strategy is a better alternative. But then extend our diss after we tell you that like relations with the US get worse, and that doesn't solve, or like it makes multilateralism and cooperation worse. They say we have no impact. That's literally their only response. That's such a cop-out because we tell you that solving key foreign policy issues like terrorism and like nuclearization, that's the impact. Like we're not making it's in the card that we read. But then let's go down their case. They're saying that Xi is willing to or Xi's willing to cede control, but that's not happening. China can change its policies itself, but they're not going to because what we tell you and they don't respond to it in rebuttal is that China, like at its core, the BRI is about geopolitical hegemony, and that's why they're not going to give it up. They're going to do everything they can to save it rather than cede control. But then let's go like down on their case. They tell you that there's going to be like a 2% wage increase. That's a really marginal impact on poverty. That's somewhere we're going to easily weigh because like we're actually saving people from poverty in Europe that we tell you on our case. I'll get to that later. But a 2% increase is not much. Like if people are making $2 a day and then that goes up by 2%, that's literally a couple cents. That's not going to be lifting very many people out of poverty. All they do is say that that's better to have a wage increase that's not responsive. It's really marginal. But then we also delink their power grids argument because of dependency, and like other power grids are there's no power grids that are getting there because because of our first contention, and they tell you that they're shipping retech, but it's non-unique. They can literally do that right now, make them prove why they can't do it right now, what's stopping them, and why the BRI is unique. But then at that point, let's go to our case. We're going to go for our second contention on a shift in alliances. What we tell you is that right now there's U.S.-China tensions because they're trying to like scare the U.S. basically into doing these things, or into like they're trying to scare the U.S. by like trying to get more and more European countries on board with the initiative. That gives China the power to come between the EU and the U.S. and worsen relations. That in turn weakens NATO, and when NATO weakens, Russia and China get more aggressive, and without a strong NATO, the EU militarizes by itself. That's something they also don't respond to. But that's also really bad because it leads to social spending cuts, which helps 17% of Europeans who are in poverty, which equals about 80 million, and prevents 118 million people from falling into poverty in the first place. They give you a few responses. First, they're just trying to muddle our case. They say that the U.S. won't leave NATO. Not what we're saying. We're saying that the European countries in NATO, they shift their alliances to China. They're the ones that are leaving, not the U.S. They also read this as a generic, non-unique to 5G. Perception is enough to trigger the link. All they're saying is that the countries don't. all it's saying is that like countries aren't using 5G, but the U.S. still thinks they are. That's what they're doing. But then also the EU, they said that the EU already has austerity, but still we get some access to that impact because it's getting worse. And finally, they say Russia's super aggressive, but China also gets aggressive too, and not in the EU, but in other ways. And there's some easy weighing there because like they're barely accessing any like impact on getting people out of poverty, but we're talking about how we're going to be saving 118 million people in Europe falling in poverty. Wage increases are not going to be saving that many people. We outweigh on scope.
Let's go to the top of our case. We tell you that the BRI is collapsing right now because of Chinese economic slowdown. But if you affirm the EU joins the BRI and finances it, and Xi Jinping will cede control because he wants the EU to survive, and that means there will be EU standards that reform the BRI. Their first response is that the EU infrastructure program is really good and it also promotes connectivity and things like that. This doesn't matter because we say the power grids we are talking about are unique to BRI and that's what we're going to go for. But then they say that Italy and the US, or then they read a DA about how the transatlantic alliance is going to fall apart. This doesn't matter because they forget to respond to Sam's Frontline that says Trump already says that Trump already criticizes the EU all the time and the transatlantic alliance doesn't really exist anymore because he's so isolationist. But then they say that there's no warrant for why the Xi Jinping will give up the BRI and cede control, and that he will never give it up because he needs it as a cornerstone of his foreign policy. This is exactly our warrant. He needs it as a cornerstone of his foreign policy, and that's why he wants it to survive, and that's why he will let it perform, and that's why he wants financing from the EU. Then, let's go to our third warrant about power grids. We say that the BRI is creating power grids, and Cornell evidence says that that China is uniquely doing this to create demand for green technology. The Science Daily evidence says this gives the chance for developing nations to leapfrog to green technology and decouple economic growth and carbon emissions. The Cornell evidence indicates this will create 200 million jobs by 2050, and one power grid in Brazil has already lifted 22 million people out of energy poverty, and the Malasweska evidence indicates this will lift 34 million people out of poverty because it allows nations to create energy and reorient their economies towards manufacturing and become resilient to climate change. They read a couple responses. Their first is that China isn't going to invest in the EU because of their case. Realize they don't frontline their first contention, so this response doesn't really matter. But then they say that green tech is non-unique. But no, green tech isn't non-unique because the only way these developing nations get green tech and things like that is if they have power grids in the first place. Then, let's go to their case. Let's first go to their second contention. We outweigh for a couple of reasons. Even if they impact to austerity, climate change is much more permanent because austerity is at least short-term and eventually austerity goes away once they relieve spending and things like that. But we say climate change inherently shaves in economic growth permanently because it destroys industries. But even more so, we would say we are the only adaptation to climate change because we're the only one who builds infrastructure and allows countries to reorient themselves. But even more so, climate change also outweighs on scope because it affects the entire world. But then let's get into defense. They say that the NATO is going to collapse, and it's the perception of using 5G networks. That doesn't make much sense. The US can also look up that Italy didn't sign on to 5G networks just like I did. They know that they're not going to use 5G networks. But then let's go to their impact. They say that China's going to become aggressive, but we say that Russia's already aggressive. This means that Russia aggression should have already at least triggered austerity policies. It doesn't really make any sense. If one country's aggressive, they should already be militarizing, so the austerity policies that they talk about should already be kicking in.
All right, can we take the first question? So at the end of your summary, you talk about how Russia is like super aggressive and that should have been enough to trigger austerity. Why is that?
What do you
Why would that have been enough to trigger austerity?
Because you say
They invaded Crimea.
yeah, like these like invasions of other areas, which
Yeah,
probably
but, like,
should have
NATO's
pulled in
still
NATO,
fine.
which probably should have like pulled in NATO and caused the austerity thing you're talking about. Didn't, and you never
No,
specified.
NATO is like already at that point when they invaded Crimea.
That's not the internal link into your impact. Your impact says that NATO collapses and then China and Russia become aggressive, which causes militarization.
Not really
So
collapse.
NATO's obviously not
That's
deterring
bad.
them if they're invading Crimea, right?
Well, sure, yeah.
So
Okay.
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 Wait, okay, yeah, sure. You can have a question now.
Okay. Sure. So you say that green tech is not unique. Why?
Okay, so like, what is stopping? You just keep on saying that like it's unique to BRI, but I don't understand.
Okay.
I actually just don't understand
Yeah,
why.
we say, like,
So it's
why
like a
they
nation
can't
like,
do it without the BRI?
Yeah, so it's a nation like Swaziland, right? Like they
Yeah.
probably don't have the
Or
upfront
renamed it,
capital
but-
to build like, let's build entire infrastructures around green tech. But China comes in and goes, here, we'll give you a loan so you can build green tech. That is comparatively the only way which they can access A,
China
energy
gives them a
and
loan.
B,
Like,
green
why
tech.
does that loan have to be under the BRI though?
Because that's, wait, what do you mean?
What do you mean?
I mean, if the BRI is
China
going to
gives,
collapse. Okay.
China gives
Like
infrastructure
we're saying,
loans via
China
the
is the
BRI.
only nation building power grids, and the reason it's uniquely them is because they
But
want to
whether
create
or not
demand
the
for green
BRI
technology.
exists, can't Chinese companies still
Wait,
like
that's
give?
that's-
they
Wait,
still
no, it's
can't-
not. It's the Chinese government.
It's literally like the government.
Like
so
state-owned
not-
enterprises.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
got it. Any question? question? Great. Okay, you have another question real quick.
So, what does like a weakening in NATO's unity lead to?
Okay, a weakening in NATO's unity. So what we're telling you in the link story is that when NATO weakens, that's when like China seizes this opportunity to like go and China and Russia, but you like frontline Russia really well. But anyway, what they do is they just see that like the security blanket is really, really weak, and they're able to like be more aggressive in places like Russia would probably be the Arctic, and China would be like the South China Sea. That's what we're telling you.
Okay.
Can we have a question?
Yeah.
So you talk about how like how China can change, or you just say we read the response on your unique just about Xi willing to see control. That
Yeah.
China can like change policies itself, and that there's like geopolitical hedge. That's what they want. You said, but you say that's exactly your warrant. Could you explain what that means?
So like you say that like Xi's not going to cede control because it's a cornerstone of his foreign policy. We agree it's a cornerstone of his foreign policy, so he's not going to let it collapse.
For what reason though? Like
Okay, because let's look at this comparative. His options are either A, he doesn't cede to any reform, the BRI collapses, his foreign policy falls apart, and now his people hate him, or B, he makes some recessions or makes some concessions.
Wouldn't
China
people
becomes,
him if he gives up the BRI? I mean, it's
No, he's
even
not like
his
giving it
anymore.
up.
No, like
Like,
he's
they're
just like,
still
okay,
building
we're not going to be like
infrastructure.
terrible
You
to
said
these
he cedes
nations.
control. That's like what you're reading. Case.
cedes-
Wait, but
like
also, why
reform.
does reform even matter in this round?
Yeah, no one's reading reform, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So starting with our second contention, what we tell you is that China and the U.S. have tension in the status quo, which gives China the power to become between the EU and the U.S., causing a worsening of relations. That in turn weakens NATO, and when NATO weakens, Russia and China get more aggressive. We don't say that the NATO specifically collapse. We tell it gets weak. It like weakens because of that. There's a conflict of interest between these EU countries that sign on with the BRI and America. As a result, they don't respond to the fact that like the U.S. militarizes, which increases tension. But not only that, they just say that to you, Russia's having tensions right now in the status quo. That doesn't mean anything because we tell you that it gets comparatively worse, which causes these austerity cuts that we're going to be seeing in our world, which in turn impacts to 80 million people, as well as prevents 118 million people from falling in poverty if you were to vote con. And that outweighs on scope because we tell you that we impact way more people than they do because they impact only to like the only impact that they extend throughout the round is their third on climate change, which basically says that they're only going to be creating green energy there, which I'll get to later. So not to their case, they again don't respond to the fact that we tell you that in the status quo on the non-unique overview, which we tell you that there is a better alternative right now, which is the European connectivity strategy, which we specifically say is inherently better because it causes like these investments to go like globally, and we outweigh on scope because we tell you that unlike their world, which is only going to be going to the EU, we tell this is going to impact not just EU but also Africa and the rest of Asia as well. So as a result, they still haven't told you as to why the China's BRI is better, and even then onto their warranting about how they get reforms, they still don't tell you as to why like the China will actually like bother like listening to these reforms, and as a result, you can't link them into any impacts. Then onto their third warrant on climate change, they don't provide any response to the fact that we tell you that in their world they're not going to be sending these green tech to the countries that actually need them. They're going to be prioritizing the EU, and as a result, there's not going to be any trade going to like these third world countries that specifically need this green tech infrastructure. And even then, they don't respond to the non-unique, which basically says that why hasn't there been any green tech like in the status quo, and like they don't tell you as to why it's going to continue in their world. And as a result, we outweigh on probability because we tell you that in our world we're going to see an increase in tension, whereas they said that we maybe have a chance at green tech, which in and of itself isn't going to happen because it's not going to go to the countries that need it. For these, we strongly urge upon value.
Go to the top of our case. We tell you right now that BRI is collapsing because China has a domestic economic slowdown that's stopping their ability to fund it. But they read this overview that says that the EU has its own project, which means it's all non-unique, and we need to prove why the BRI is uniquely better. Trey does in his summary, and they ignore it. We tell you the BRI is uniquely better because it gives power grids to developing nations. That's the unique offense that they never respond to, and that's why we're winning the round. Go to our third warrant on power grids. We tell you China uses the BRI to go into the developing world and build power grids that allow these nations to use green tech and sustainable energy, which pulls them out of energy poverty. When they're pulled out of energy poverty, their economic productivity increases, which is why in Brazil, when they install power grids, 22 million people were lifted out of poverty. We tell you it will create 200 million jobs, and when the BRI is completed, it will pull 34 million people out of poverty. They read this one thing that says green tech should be non-unique because developing nations will do it now. That ignores the entire warrant. We tell you only when you affirm does China give the actual loans to developing nations to where they can afford green tech. When if without the BRI, they're just poor nations that can't afford it on their own. Then let's do the weighing. We're going to outweigh their case in three ways. First is on austerity. Climate change is always going to outlast austerity. Austerity policies eventually end when the economy recovers, but climate change lasts forever, and you can't undo it when we go past the brink, which means it's locked in and extinction is guaranteed down the line. At some point, we can't do anything to change it. The second is we are the only world in which we can adapt to climate change, because in their world, the developing world remains developing, but in our world, they get power grids, they get infrastructure, their economies develop, and they actually are allowed to become sustainable and adapt to the climate change, which is going to happen anyways. But then third is on scope. Climate change affects literally every single person on the planet. They're only affecting these like EU countries, which are like comparatively limited scope. But then fourth is on developing nations. Always look to developing nations' impacts, because in the developing world they don't have things like social safety nets that prevent people from like dying in poverty. Whereas in the EU they have social policies and healthcare and things, which means that even if people go into poverty in the EU, they aren't going to be dying. But then let's go into the defense. It's really simple. First, if their link is true, the Russian aggression and invasion in Crimea should have already triggered their militarization and austerity impacts. The fact that it didn't mean their link isn't true. But then secondarily, NATO obviously isn't a deterrent, because Russian aggression means that like NATO was never a deterrent, which means that Russia, like NATO weakening isn't going to be the unique reason China and Russia escalate in their world.